History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 3, Classical Mediterranean. Chapter 4, The Hellenistic World. The history of Greece rapidly becomes less interesting after the 5th century. It is also less important. What remains important is the history of Greek civilization, and the shape of this, paradoxically, was determined by a kingdom in the northern Greece, which some said was not Greek at all, Macedon. In the second half of the 4th century, it created an empire bigger than any yet seen, the legate of both Persia and the city states. It organized the world we call Hellenistic because of the preponderance and uniting force within it of a culture, Greek in inspiration and language. Yet Macedon was a barbarous place, perhaps centuries behind Athens in quality of life and culture. The story begins with the decline of Persian power. Persian recovery in alliance with Sparta had masked important internal weaknesses. One of them is commemorated by a famous book, The Anabasis of Xenophon, the story of the long march of an army of Greek mercenaries back up the Tigris and across the mountains to the Black Sea, after an unsuccessful attempt on the Persian throne by a brother of the king. This was only a minor and subsidiary episode in the important story of Persian decline, an offshoot of one particular crisis of internal division. Throughout the 4th century, that empire's troubles continued, with province after province, among them Egypt, which won its independence as early as 404 BC and held it for 60 years, slipping out of control. A major revolt by the Western satraps took a long time to master, and though in the end imperial rule was restored, the cost had been great. What at last reimposed a Persian rule was often weak. One ruler tempted by the possibilities of this decline was the Philip II of Macedon, a not very highly regarded northern kingdom whose power rested on a warrior aristocracy. It was a rough, tough society, its rulers still somewhat like the warlords of Homeric times, their power resting more on personal ascendancy than institutions. Whether this was a state which was a part of the world of the Hellenes was disputed. Some Greeks thought Macedonians barbarians. On the other hand, their kings claimed descent from Greek houses, one going back to Heracles, and their claim was generally recognized. Philip himself sought status. He wanted Macedon to be thought of as Greek. When he became regent of Macedon in 359 BC, he began a steady acquisition of territory at the expense of other Greek states. His ultimate argument was an army which became, by the end of his reign, the best trained and organized in Greece. The Macedonian military tradition had emphasized heavy armored cavalry, and this continued to be a major arm. Philip added to this tradition the benefit of lessons about infantry he had drawn while a hostage at Thebes in his youth. From hoplite tactics, he evolved a new weapon, the 16 deep phalanx of pikemen. The men in its ranks carried pikes twice as long as a hoplite spear, and they operated in a more open formation. Pike shafts from the second and third ranks running between men in the front to present a much denser array of weapons for the charge. Another advantage of the Macedonians was a grasp of siege warfare techniques not shown by other Greek armies. They had catapults which made it possible to force a besieged town's defenders to take cover while battering rams, mobile towers, and mounds of earth were brought into play. Such things had previously been seen only in the armies of Assyria and their Asian successors. Finally, Philip ruled a fairly wealthy state. Its riches much increased once he had acquired the gold mines of Mount Pangam, though he spent so much that he left huge debts. He used his power first to ensure the effective unification of Macedon itself. Within a few years, the infant for whom he was regent was deposed and Philip was elected king. Then he began to look to the south and northeast. In these areas, expansion sooner or later meant encroachment upon the interests and position of Athens. Her allies in Rhodes, Kos, Chios, and Byzantium placed themselves under Macedonian patronage. Another Phocas went down in a war in which Athens had egged her on but failed to give effective support. Although Demosthenes, the last great agitator of Athenian democracy, made himself a place in history, still recalled the word Philip. By warning his countrymen of the dangers they faced, he could not save them. When the war between Athens and Macedon, 355 to 346 BC, at last ended, Philip had won not only Thessaly but had established himself in central Greece and controlled the pass of Thermopylae. His situation favored designs on Thrace, and this implied a return of Greek interest towards Persia. One Athenian writer advocated a Hellenic crusade to exploit Persia's weaknesses, in opposition to Demosthenes, who continued to denounce the Macedonian barbarian. And once more, plans were made to liberate the Asian cities, a notion attractive enough to bear fruit in a reluctant league of Corinth formed by the major Greek states other than Sparta in 337 BC. Philip was its president and general, and it was somewhat reminiscent of the Delian League. The apparent independence of its members was a sham, for they were Macedonian satellites. Though the culmination of Philip's work and reign, he was assassinated the following year. It had only come into being after Macedon had defeated the Athenians and Thebans again in 338 BC. The terms of peace imposed by Philip were not harsh, but the League had to agree to go to war with Persia under Macedonian leadership. There was one more kick of Greek independence after Philip's death, and his son and successor, Alexander, crushed the Greek rebels as he did others in other parts of his kingdom. Thebes was then razed to the ground and its population enslaved. 335 BC. This was the real end of 4 centuries of Greek history. During this period, civilization had been created and sheltered by the city state, one of the most successful political forms the world had ever known. Now, not for the first time, nor the last, the future seemed to belong to the bigger battalions and the bigger organizations. Mainland Greece was from this time a political backwater under Macedonian governors and garrisons. Like his father, Alexander sought to conciliate the Greeks by giving them a large measure of internal self government in return for adherence to his foreign policy. This was always to leave some Greeks, notably the Athenian Democrats, unreconciled. When Alexander died, Athens once more tried to organize an anti Macedonian coalition. The results were disastrous. A part of the price of defeat was the replacement of democracy by oligarchy at Athens, 332 BC. Demosthenes fled to an island off the coast, seeking sanctuary in the temple of Poseidon there, but poisoned himself when the Macedonians came for him. A Macedonian governor henceforth ruled the Peloponnese. Alexander's reign had thus begun with difficulties, but once they were surmounted, he could turn his attention to Persia. In 334 BC, he crossed to Asia at the head of an army, of which a quarter was drawn from Greece. There was more than idealism in this. Aggressive war might also be prudent, for the fine army left by Philip had to be paid if it was not to present a threat to the new king, and conquest would provide the money. He was 22 years old, and before him lay a short career of conquest so brilliant that it would leave his name a myth down the ages and provide a setting for the widest expansion of Greek culture. He drew the city states into a still wider world. The story is simple to summarize. Legend says that after crossing to Asia Minor, he cut the Gordian knot. He then defeated the Persians at the Battle of Issus. This was followed by a campaign which swept south through Syria, destroying Tyre on the way, and eventually to Egypt, where Alexander founded the city still bearing his name. In every battle, he was his own best soldier, and he was wounded several times in the melee. He pushed into the desert, interrogated the oracle at Siva, and then went back to Asia to inflict a second and decisive defeat on Darius III in 331 BC. Persepolis was sacked and burnt, and Alexander proclaimed successor to the Persian throne. Darius was murdered by one of his satraps the next year. On went Alexander, pursuing the Iranians of the northeast into Afghanistan, where Kandahar is another of the many cities which commemorate his name, and penetrating 100 miles or so beyond the Indus into the Punjab. He then turned back because his army would go no further. It was tired, and having defeated an army with 200 elephants, may have been disinclined to face the further 5,000 reported to be waiting for it in the Ganges Valley. Alexander returned to Babylon. There he died in 323 BC, 32 years old, and just 10 years after he had left Macedon. Both his conquests and his organization in the empire bear the stamp of individual genius. The word is not too strong, for achievement on this scale is more than the fruit of good fortune, favorable historical circumstance, or blind determinism. Alexander was a creative mind and something of a visionary, even if self absorbed and obsessed with his pursuit of glory. With great intelligence, he combined almost reckless courage. He believed his mother's ancestor to be Homer's Achilles and strove to emulate the hero. He was ambitious as much to prove himself in men's eyes, or perhaps those of his forceful and repellent mother, as to win new lands. The idea of the Hellenic crusade against Persia undoubtedly had reality for him, but he was also, for all his admiration of Greek culture, of which he had learnt from his tutor Aristotle, too egocentric to be a missionary, and his cosmopolitanism was grounded in an appreciation of realities. His empire had to be run by Persians as well as Macedonians. Alexander himself married first a Bactrian and then a Persian princess, and accepted, unfittingly, thought some of his companions. The homage which the East rendered to rulers it thought to be godlike. He was also at times rash and impulsive. It was his soldiers who finally made him turn back at the Indus, and the ruler of Macedon had no business to plunge into battle with no attention for what would happen to the monarchy if he should die without a successor. Worse still, he killed a friend in a drunken brawl, and he may have arranged his father's murder. Alexander lived too short a time either to ensure the unity of his empire in the future or to prove to posterity that even he could not have held it together for long. What he did in this time is undoubtedly impressive. The foundation of 25 cities is by itself a considerable matter, even if some of them were only spruced up strong points. They were keys to the Asian land routes. The integration of East and the West in their government was still more difficult, but Alexander took it a long way in 10 years. Of course, he had little choice. There were not enough Greeks and Macedonians to conquer and govern the whole empire. From the first, he ruled through Persian officials in the conquered areas, and after coming back from India, he began to reorganize of the army in mixed regiments of Macedonians and Persians. His adoption of Persian dress and his attempt to exact prostration, an obligatory kowtow like that which so many Europeans in recent times found degrading when it was asked for by Chinese rulers, from his compatriots as well as from Persians, also antagonized his followers, for they revealed his taste for Oriental manners. There were plots and mutinies. They were not successful, and his relatively mild reprisals do not suggest that the situation was ever very dangerous for Alexander. The crisis was followed by his most spectacular gesture of cultural integration when taking Darius's daughter as his wife, in addition to his Batrachian princess Roxana. He then officiated at the mass wedding of 9,000 of his soldiers to Eastern women. This was the famous marriage of the East and West, an act of state rather than of idealism, for the new empire had to be cemented together if it was to survive. What the empire really meant in cultural interplay is more difficult to assess. There was certainly a wider physical dispersal of Greeks, but the results of this were only to appear after Alexander's death, when the formal framework of empire collapsed and yet the cultural fact of a Hellenistic world emerged from it. We do not know, in fact, very much about the life in Alexander's empire, but it must be unlikely given its brief duration, the limitations of ancient government, and the lack of will to embark upon fundamental change, that most of its inhabitants found things very different in 323 BC from what they had known 10 years before. Alexander's impact was made in the east. He did not reign long enough to affect the interplay of the Western Greeks with Carthage, which was the main preoccupation of the later 4th century in the West. In Greece itself, things stayed quiet until his death. It was in Asia that he ruled lands no Greeks had ruled before. In Persia, he had proclaimed himself heir to the great king, and rulers in the northern satrapies of Bithynia, Cappadocia, and Armenia did him homage. Weak as the cement of the Alexandrine Empire must have been, it was subjected to intolerable strain when he died without a competent heir. His generals fell into fighting for what they could get and keep, and the empire was dissolving even before the birth of his posthumous son by Roxana. She had already murdered his second wife, so when she and her son died in the troubles, any hope of direct descent vanished. In 40 odd years of fighting, it was settled that there would be no reconstitution of Alexander's empire. There emerged instead a group of big states, each of them a hereditary monarchy. They were founded by successful soldiers, the diadochi or successors. Ptolemy Soter, one of Alexander's best generals, had at once seized power in Egypt on his master's death, and to it he subsequently conveyed the valuable prize of Alexander's body. Ptolemy's descendants were to rule the province for nearly 300 years until the death of Cleopatra in 30 BC. Ptolemaic Egypt was the longest lived and richest of the successor states. Of the Asian Empire, the Indian territories and some of Afghanistan passed out of Greek hands altogether, being ceded to an Indian ruler in return for military help. The rest of it was, by 300 BC, a huge kingdom of 1.5 million square miles and perhaps 30 million subjects, stretching from Afghanistan to Syria. The site of its capital, Antioch. The vast domain was ruled by the descendants of Seleucus, another Macedonian general. Attacks by migrating Celts from northern Europe, who had already invaded Macedonia itself, led to its partial disruption early in the 3rd century BC, and part of it thenceforth formed the kingdom of Pergamon, ruled by a dynasty called the Attalids, who pushed the Celts further into Asia Minor. The Seleucids kept the rest, though they were to lose Bactria in 225 BC, where descendants of Alexander's soldiers set up a remarkable Greek kingdom, Macedon, under another dynasty, the Antigonids, strove to retain the control of the Greek states contested in the Aegean by the Ptolemaic fleet and in Asia Minor by Seleucids. Once again, about 265 BC, Athens made a bid for independence but failed. These events are complicated but not very important for our purpose. What mattered more was that for about 60 years after 280 BC, the Hellenistic kingdoms lived in a rough balance of power, preoccupied with events in the eastern Mediterranean and Asia, and except for the Greeks and Macedonians, paying little attention to events further west. This provided a peaceful setting for the greatest extension of Greek culture, and this is why these states are important. It is their contribution to the diffusion and growth of a civilization that constitute their claim on our attention, not the obscure politics and unrewarding struggles of the diadochi. Greek was now the official language of the whole Near East. Even more important, it was the language of the cities, the foci of the New World. Under the Seleucids, the union of Hellenistic and Oriental civilization to which Alexander may have aspired began to be a reality. They urgently sought Greek immigrants and founded new cities wherever they could as a means of providing some solid framework for their empire and of Hellenizing the local population. The cities were the substance of Seleucid power, for beyond them stretched the heterogeneous hinterland of tribes, Persian vassal princes. Seleucid administration was still based fundamentally upon the satrapies. The theory of absolutism was inherited by the Seleucid kings from the Achaemenids, just as was their system of taxation. Yet it is not certain what this meant in practice, and the East seems to have been less closely governed than Mesopotamia and Asia Minor, where Hellenistic influence was strongest and where the capital lay. The size of the Hellenistic cities here far surpassed those of the older Greek immigrations. Alexandria, Antioch, and the new capital city, Seleucia, near Babylon, quickly achieved populations of between 1 and 200,000. This reflected economic growth as well as conscious policy. The wars of Alexander and his successors released an enormous booty, much of it in bullion, accumulated by the Persian Empire. It stimulated economic life all over the Near East, but also brought the evils of inflation and instability. Nevertheless, the overall trend was towards greater wealth. There were no great innovations either in manufacture or in the tapping of new natural resources. The Mediterranean economy remained much what it had always been, except in scale, but Hellenistic civilization was richer than its predecessors and population growth was one sign of it. Its wealth sustained governments of some magnificence, raising large revenues and spending them in spectacular and sometimes commendable ways. The ruins of the Hellenistic cities show expenditure on the appurtenances of Greek urban life. Theaters and gymnasia abound, games and festivals were held in all of them. This probably did not much affect the native populations of the countryside, who paid the taxes, and some of them represented what would now be called westernization. Nonetheless, it was a solid achievement. Through the cities, the East was Hellenized in a way which was to mark it until the coming of Islam. Soon, they produced their own Greek literature. Yet, though this was a civilization of Greek cities, in spirit it was unlike that of the past, as some Greeks noted sorely. The Macedonians had never known the life of city state, and their creations in Asia lacked its vigor. The Seleucids founded scores of cities but maintained the old autocratic and centralized administration of the satrapies above that level. Bureaucracy was highly developed and well self government languished. Ironically, besides having to bear the burden of disaster in the past, the cities of Greece itself, where a flickering tradition of independence lived on, were the one part of the Hellenistic world that actually underwent economic demographic decline. Though the political nerve had gone, the city culture still served as a great transmission system for Greek ideas. Large endowments provided at Alexandria and Pergamon, the two greatest libraries of the ancient world. Ptolemy I also founded the museum, a kind of institute of advanced study. In Pergamon, a king endowed schoolmasterships, and it was there that people perfected the use of parchment when the Ptolemies cut off supplies of papyrus. In Athens, the academy and the lyceum survived, and from such sources, the tradition of Greek intellectual activity was everywhere refreshed. Much of this activity was academic in the narrow sense that it was, in essence, commentary on the past achievement, but much of it was also of high quality and now seems lacking in weight only because of the gigantic achievements of the 5th and 4th centuries. It was a tradition solid enough to endure right through the Christian era, though much of its content has been irretrievably lost. Eventually, the world of Islam would receive the teaching of Plato and Aristotle through what had been passed on by Hellenistic scholars. Hellenistic civilization preserved the Greek tradition most successfully in science, and here Alexandria, the greatest of all Hellenistic cities, was preeminent. Euclid was the greatest systemizer of geometry, defining it until the 19th century, and Archimedes, who is famous for his practical achievements in the construction of war machines in Sicily, was probably Euclid's pupil. Another Alexandrian, Eratosthenes, was the first man to measure the size of the earth, and yet another hero is said to have invented a steam engine and certainly used steam to transmit energy. It is inconceivable that the state of contemporary metallurgy could ever have made the widespread application of this discovery practicable, which probably explains why we hear no more of it. The point is of general relevance. The intellectual achievements of the ancient world and of European medieval civilization later often pushed up to the limits of existing technical skills but could not be expected to go beyond them. Further progress had to wait for better instrumentation. Another Hellenistic Greek, Aristarchus of Samos, got so far as to say that the earth moved around the sun, though his views were set aside by contemporaries and posterity because they could not be squared with Aristotelian physics, which stated the contrary. The truth or falsity of both views remained untested experimentally. In hydrostatistics, it is true, Archimedes made great strides, but the central achievement of the Greek tradition was always mathematical, not practical, and in Hellenistic times, it reached its apogee with the theory of conic sections and ellipses and the founding of trigonometry. These were important additions to humanity's toolkit, yet they were less distinct from what went before then was Hellenistic moral and political philosophy. It is tempting to find the reason for this in political change from the city state to larger units. It was still in Athens that the philosophy of age found its greatest center, and Aristotle had hoped to reinvigorate the city state. In the right hands, he thought it could still provide the framework for the good life. the unhappy last age of the city state after the Peloponnesian War, and the size of impersonality of the new monarchies must have soon sapped such confidence. In them, the old patriotic impulse of the city states had dried up. Efforts were made to find other ways of harnessing public loyalty and emotion. Perhaps because of the need to impress non Greeks, perhaps because they felt the positive attraction of the world beyond Greek culture. The new monarchs buttressed themselves more and more with Oriental cults attached to the person of the ruler, whose origins went back into the Mesopotamian and Egyptian past. Extravagant titles were employed, but perhaps much of this was flattery. Soter, as Ptolemy the First was called, meant savior. The Seleucids allowed themselves to be worshipped, but the Ptolemies outdid them. They took over the divine status and prestige of the pharaohs, and practiced too, to the extent of marrying their sisters. Meanwhile, the real basis of the Hellenistic states was bureaucracy, unchecked by traditions of civic independence. Since the Seleucids had founded and refounded most of the Greek cities in Asia, what they had given they could take back, and armies of Greek and Macedonian mercenaries, which relieved them of dependence on native troops. Powerful and awe inspiring though they might be, there was little in such structures to capture their mixed subjects, loyalties, and emotions.